So what happens after a commission makes its report to a community, specifically the Ferguson Commission? The challenges the commissioners have identified are tough, and the work they have called us to can seem overwhelming. Did the Ferguson Commission give us a path forward that we can actually walk, or is it a broad document of ideals destined to collect dust? Tonight, what's next for the year's worth of work from the Ferguson Commission? Stay tuned.
Stay Tuned brings together local experts, journalists, civic leaders, and regular people to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Add your voice to our conversation, and you're at the table as we stay on top of current events and go deeper, bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. From the 9 network of public media in Grand Center, this is Stay Tuned. The Ferguson Commission issued its report, and now the region, the nation, and the world are wondering what will come of it. A lot of commissions have issued a lot of reports over the last 50 years in the wake of civil unrest or disasters, and little seems to happen in the way of reform. How will St. Louis make this report different? Many have already found some hope in the Commission's work in that it's made up of a diverse group of people with an array of perspectives, and they found a way to come to agreement on so many things that should be done. Republicans, Democrats, Independents all agreeing on some aggressive proposals. Of course, it's not up to the commissioners to make these proposals reality. From police reforms to Medicaid expansion to transportation and race relations, state legislators have already taken a stand against some of the proposals. Is there any chance they'll change their minds? Some who support the commission's work critique it as too broad and unfocused. So did the Ferguson Commission aim too high, or is St. Louis thinking too small?
Jason Rosenbaum from St. Louis Public Radio is here to help us get our head around, 200 pages or so, the commission report.
More or less.
It's a digital report. They say it's digital so it can't collect dust. I think that's a joke we've heard a few times at the commission meetings.
Well, that's the first time I've heard it, and I think it's hilarious.
I don't believe you for a second. The governor's called it unflinching. I think some commissioners have said it's unflinching. Is it?
I think in a way it is, because if you read the first part of it, it is a pretty blunt assessment of how racially divided St. Louis is and how economically and socially divided St. Louis is. And I think that was purposeful. If you ask people on the commission why they put that in there, it's because other commissions that were started after racially charged riots overlooked race and overlooked social divisions. And I think that they were purposely trying to avoid that. And I think that the governor wanted an unflinching look at the root causes that were kind of behind the unrest that happened after Michael Brown's shooting death. And I think if you read at least the first part of the report that lays out the thematic elements of it, I think they may have reached their goal there.
So it's frank in its assessment of the situation. Is it? What do you think about the calls to action that they've come up with? There were several. There were like 200 or something originally, and they whittled them down.
There were dozens, and some of them are signature, which were highlighted closer to the top, as well as a lot of non-signature calls to action. Many of them, I think, can be done without legislative action, especially the education and healthcare related recommendations. A lot of them could be done by like nonprofit organizations or individual schools or individual police departments, even when you're talking about law enforcement. But when you're talking about things that are going to stretch across multiple jurisdictions or even across the whole state, it will need the legislature. And as was kind of mentioned in the beginning segment, the legislature has been slow to act on law enforcement overhauls since Michael Brown's death. I was going to say last year, but this past session, they did pass a multifaceted municipal courts bill, but there were many other law enforcement related bills that passed in other states, such as body camera regulations, use of force database, even changing the use of force law that was declared unconstitutional a long time ago. None of those ended up passing, and I think that's where a lot of the pessimism comes from that.
Even some things passed in state, like Texas, for instance, passed some things that we did not. Is that right?
Texas passed a pretty comprehensive body camera law that actually funds body cameras in other police departments. And Texas is arguably a more conservative state than Missouri. They have a Republican governor. I think actually every statewide official in Texas is Republican, and they have a very Republican legislature. So I think that people point to situations like that, as well as states like Colorado, which is kind of purplish, also passing a lot of things, and comparing to what happened in Missouri this year, and the results kind of speak for themselves. So I think that's why there is a little bit of pessimism, because they saw what happened this year in the legislature. And while they didn't do nothing, because the municipal court overhaul is a big deal, a lot of the things that are in this report didn't end up passing.
Will it be any different next session?
I think that's remains to be seen. Some of the things that didn't pass were worked on. The legislature did work on body camera regulations. They did work on use of force. They didn't work on every aspect of the law enforcement related things. But I think the fact that they worked on it gives them a place to start next year. Some of the other things in the report, such as Medicaid expansion or a $15 an hour minimum wage, that's going to be a lot harder to get through a Republican-controlled legislature. And it may either require a major shift in the composition of the legislature or doing it by a statewide initiative in the case of the minimum wage.
What about the things you said that won't require the legislature? Who's going to oversee that? Who's going to make sure those things get done?
Well, the commission sunsets after December 31st, but they are looking for an organization that is going to oversee some of the efforts to implement some of these ideas. And again, some of the people that are going to be carrying the ball, especially in the St. Louis area, that there'll be nonprofit groups, there'll be education activists, because a lot of the things in the report have to do with education, and while some of it might require some legislation, you could probably go into an individual school and make changes to the school discipline policy internally without having to pass like an entire law that is done through a state legislature or a local entity. So it's going to be things like that that I think that outside groups could do without the legislature. But again, some of them are going to require legislative action.
A lot, as you said, remains to be seen.
Yes.
Jason Rosenbaum, St. Louis Public Radio, stay with us. But first, we want to introduce you to a couple of folks, an interesting relationship that developed on the Ferguson Commission. Let's meet the protester and the police officer who met each other on the commission.
Once I found out that Kevin was on the commission and I found out he was a police officer, I was a lot of skeptical. I was like, I don't know if I'm be on this commission. I'm not gonna be able to work with him. I'm not gonna be able to really even look at him without thinking Darren Wilson supporter.
Obviously, there's a breach in trust between the community and police, and part of the problem is not knowing each other.
Even when Ferguson happened, I tried to give the police the benefit of the doubt. But as I went out there, I got this police didn't care about what we were doing feeling from their actions, calling us rude names, N-word, arresting people for no reason, just several things, the tear gas, all these things that they were doing was showing that they didn't care.
I think Roisin maybe had a little bit of apprehension for our first meeting.
Yeah, Kevin was he's probably the #1 enemy on this commission in my eye. Sorry, Kevin.
I've been a police officer for 32 years. I've dealt with all kinds of people. I believe that if you treat people with respect, you get respect back, and that's exactly how we started out.
Some people may look at Kevin or some people may look at me and really judge us off the first instinct, judge us off what they Google or judge us off our occupation. But until you really get to know the individual, then you really understand.
And I think once people talk, they realize everybody wants to achieve the same goal. The means to get to those ends might be a little different, but in the end, everybody wants to get to the same place.
We can continue to protest, that's not a problem, because there's still issues going on, but eventually we do have to find a way to build relationships, because we can't be like this forever. We have generations after us, kids coming up, that we can't continue down the same cycle.
And I think Roisin's realizing that that's part of being an effective leader. I don't think Roisin came into this thinking he was going to become a formal leader, but guess what? you pretty much are now, and that's what makes a good leader a leader. And he's got those good qualities to do that.
And those two commissioners are in the studio with us now, Roisin Aldridge and Kevin Allbrand. Just watching you guys here now, are you guys friends?
No, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, we can say that.
When you sat down on like day one of the Ferguson Commission, did you think there was a place for a protester in the serious work that you're about to take on?
Well, absolutely, because that's the reason we got to where we are. And I don't remember when we first met, but we saw the need to talk outside of commission, and we actually met for coffee. And
Or the two of you guys?
Yeah, and because I thought it was important that we talked one-on-one, and we sat hour and a half, talked, and came to some understandings. We didn't agree on everything, but we came to some understandings.
Do you remember that cup of coffee?
Yep, I remember that cup of coffee, and it was like, am I really meeting with this guy? Coming from being a protester in the early days, because when the commission got formed, it was still very heated in Ferguson, and my emotions towards law enforcement was very angry and hurt still. So it wasn't the first person that I would have, wanted to have coffee with. But I do appreciate Kevin for extending that hand out. It definitely didn't come from me, and it was something that at that beginning really changed the outcome of how our relationship.
He made the first move. Is that what you're saying?
He did. He pushed up on me first.
So I'm curious. We've got a lot of this report that's to be discussed and talked about. But are you different now than before you started on the commission?
Maybe a little bit. I definitely see the other side of the coin a little bit more. I don't think I've changed. I think I've been the same type of person throughout my whole life. Yeah. Relationships are it seems simplistic, but reforming broken relationships and creating new ones is the key for all of this to begin. And that's how the whole commission, I don't know how many people Roisin knew, but I didn't know anybody on that commission when we started, and I could pretty much say we're all pretty good friends right now.
Mm-hmm. What was the work like? Because I mean, with that many proposals whittled down to 30, if it was a PTO meeting, it wouldn't go smooth. What was the work like?
They didn't go smooth. They didn't all go smooth, I can tell you that. There was some very spirited discussion, And when you get that group of people, very smart people and driven people together, there is spirited discussion, and that was good. Because there were a lot of things that didn't make the recommendations that I was adamantly opposed to, and there were things that I didn't agree with that did make it. But yeah, there were some heated meetings. Yeah,
we didn't necessarily always agree with each other, commissioners, let alone the community who brought the recommendations to us. But we started off really, like Kevin said, not knowing each other. I knew Starsky and Tracy a little bit from being out in the streets, but not the other ones on the commission. So not having that relationship and having to work on such a tough issue and talking about race and not maybe knowing where Kevin's going to come from, it made it a difficult process. And it wasn't always, yay. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, as you've seen at the commission meetings, it was a lot of anger sometimes, honestly, of passion built behind certain recommendations that felt would benefit the community, benefit the city, the region.
So without sounding too after-school special, I mean, is there anything that you guys learned in your relationship or in the relationships you built across the commission that we can kind of take out on a macro level? Is there work that maybe you guys did that can give us some hope for the rest of the region as we look at the recommendations and the calls to action?
Well, and specifically as it relates to law enforcement, I think it's about rebuilding the relationships. And I think one of the big problems was during the economic downturn, cities were losing money. And one of the first budgets that got hit was public safety. Now, COPS programs that were in place before were the first things that got cut. So some police agencies were just responding call to call, did not have time to do their problem-oriented policing. And now I think we're getting back to that. Department of Justice just released a bunch of COPS grant money back. So hopefully we'll have time to get out of the cars and do the problem-oriented policing and rebuild those relationships. And I think that's the important thing.
Mm-hmm. And to piggyback a little bit on it, I honestly believe relationships are key. If you don't know who's in your community, and if you don't, if I'm an officer and I'm driving down the street, if there was a relationship between Darren Wilson and Michael Brown, it may not turn out the same way. Darren Wilson could have been like, hey, Mike, get out the street, but not having that relationship with the people in that community, it makes a big difference. I remember being young and living in the 5th Ward in Murphy Park, and the police used to pull into our complex, and they used to hand out baseball cards, and you kind of built a rapport with that police officer. Besides seeing him, maybe pull over one or two, that's not the only interaction that you've seen of law enforcement and in your community. They were coming in, they were talking to you, they would joke with you, you would laugh a little bit, and especially at a young age, having that relationship start was it made me look at things differently. Even going out into Ferguson, I think that's why it was so difficult for me, because I gave law enforcement the benefit of the doubt, because there was a little bit of a relationship built when I was young.
You remember the baseball card handing out days?
Yeah, that was huge program. We did that for several years in the city of St. Louis, and to be quite frank, it was probably budget reasons why we don't do that anymore.
I'm curious. One key issue, and we have so many that are on this report that you hope people focus on. You talk about relationships, but I'm thinking of the actual action items.
The two biggest things that if in my opinion, I think if we pull out this report that would make a huge difference in our region is, and I know it's going to be difficult, one is consolidating some of these municipalities, knowing that some of these municipalities cannot operate if they're not really pulling over the community, if they're not using the community as almost a collection agency. And also really looking at some of the things around youth thriving. And I think that's a huge problem in our region, is we haven't really thought about what economic mobility really is. We continue to look at economic development and not really economic mobility. And those are two different things. And if we look at some of those recommendations and really, like the childhood savings account, giving students or young people an account when they come into this world, so when they go into college, there's already money, putting people at the same playing field, really.
It's hard to pick one thing, I guess, and maybe that's the point, that it's going to take more than just one thing. Let's take one quick break, because we want to inform this conversation with folks at home with hashtag StayTunedSTL. Every Tuesday we have a Twitter chat. Let's hear what you had to say this week that can apply to this show.
Tuesday night's Stay Tuned Twitter chat got several reactions on the recommendations from the Ferguson Commission. The participants seemed to be pleased with what the Ferguson Commission proposed. Rachel McShane said, "The report clearly showed how race plays a role. We as a city need to get our heads out of the sand and deal with this." At Pubhole Wonk interjected, not to sidetrack, but what the commission itself did right was stay public and engaged. The report is the voice of the participants. Some of the chat participants felt the report could have named names better. When asked what will be the most difficult hurdle in implementing the recommendations, Jimmy Alhuri said, "Accountability. It is near impossible to hold anyone accountable when multiple large entities are listed." During the chat, Michael Bricky questioned if other members of our community would read the report for themselves. Plenty of the conversation around the report has been on the assumption that it would collect dust on shelves across the region. St. Louis Social Group felt the commission would be to blame if the report just sits on a shelf, where Casey Hinton feels that the report would sit on a shelf, but not to any fault of the commission. Want to be a part of our next chat? Follow us on Twitter at StayTunedSTL and follow the conversation on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. with the hashtag StayTunedSTL.
Jason's back with us at the table, but Kevin, just back to what we were just talking about, maybe something to take. What are you most proud of the work that you guys accomplished? What do you, if ever, if good, well-intentioned, well-informed citizens, there are a lot of them who won't have time to read this entire report. What would you hope that they know from what you guys did?
Well, specifically, things that were brought forward in Senate Bill 5 for years, and some people were surprised. We have been very opposed to ticket quota systems. We've known it's been a problem. I'm glad that that's finally going to come to fruition to put a stop to that. The aim towards officer wellness, which was part of the training, which I think is huge, because we have been woefully inadequate in looking at our police officers' mental and physical wellness, and quite frankly, that's what really affects how they do their job. So I think that's really an important piece, and I think we've been behind the ball on that, and I think that's going to be huge.
Yeah, that one doesn't seem to have gotten as much publicity, but I've heard that talked about in a lot of the meetings, that wellness component of the officer.
When an officer doesn't feel right when he's doing the job, that's going to affect how he interacts with the public. So I think that's a trickle-down effect that's going to be really important.
Is that something that was embraced by a large number of the commissioners, or was that something that seemed to be a priority?
Yeah, I think the law enforcement and the community and law enforcement work group, especially after everything happened, was probably the work group that everyone was looking at. This was the first priority that Ferguson and the residents said, we want this to be the first issue. And, thank God with the co-chairs and all the members, including Kevin and Brittany, who served on the President Task Force, that was able to take some of those and the knowledge that they had, Dan Isom, to really look into some issues that we never really thought about, like officer wellness. If they're not out there well, and if they're not, mentally well or physically well, they're not going to do their job well. And that's for anybody, but officers, we need to make sure they are taken care of, because they have such a huge role, protecting and serving the community.
Jason, I think it's fair to say there's been a fair amount of criticism that the report as a whole is just too broad. Is that something you've heard?
I think that I've heard a lot of different lines of criticism. One is just that commissions like this historically haven't worked, which, as I alluded to before, I think the commissioners were cognizant of that. I think that some of the proposals are clearly going to run into political opposition. Even bringing in the Attorney General as the person to look into police-involved shootings, I mean, that is not going to be a universally popular thing in the legislature or among prosecutors. But I think I think broadness, while that might have been another criticism, I think, as I said before, there are some things within that report that can be implemented without a governmental entity being the deciding factor. And I think if people are really motivated to change the landscape of St. Louis's educational, healthcare, and economic development landscape, they're going to look at these recommendations and they're going to put the energy and try and do that internally in those places that I mentioned.
So was that something you guys were thinking of, about whether or not an idea was doable before you put it on the piece of paper or put it in the digital file?
Well, the governor charged us with making unflinching recommendations, and that's what we did. And I think a good thing about being broad is that when people say, hey, well, what can I do? There's so many things. Well, pick one or two and figure out what organization is going to do those one or two action items and work with them. So there's plenty of opportunity there for people to pick out what they think they want to work on, and I think being broad is good.
Do you think, Jason, talk about motivation, do you think half the population may not feel like they have much motivation? They might be ready to wash their hands of this.
Well, and you know what? It's not the commission's role to see this goes forward, because people are going to say, what are you going to do? Our answer is no, what are you going to do to make sure our region gets better by working on this?
And I said this before at a forum at St. Louis Public Radio, but I'll say it again because I think it's important. I have a 20-month-old son, and we plan to stay in St. Louis, my wife and I, for the foreseeable future. The question that I have to ask every night is this the particular community right now that I want him to be in 20 or 15 or 10 years? A community that is segregated, a community that has educational deficiencies, and a community that's divided. And if the answer is yes, then everything that we talked about tonight is still going to be in place in 10, 15, 20 years. But if the answer is no, then I think individual people are going to be incentivized to work within their spheres of influence and try to make this community better. It's going to be people, it's going to be policymakers, it's going to be organizations, and the incentive, I think, is for the next generation.
Are you okay with the time it might take to get this done? I've heard people say things like, if you got a good idea, and let's say it does require the legislature, be prepared for a 5-year window to get it done.
Mm-hmm. I'm optimistic, but I've been living in Missouri for a while, so I'm starting to see how things work out. I know it's going to take time. The civil rights movement, we made huge accomplishments, but we still have to continue to fight. I think even, when people look at, like you say, is it too broad? It's so many issues that we need to start addressing. It's not just law enforcement, it's not just education, it's not just health, it is all these issues, and we can't just solely say we're just gonna, pioneer this law enforcement agenda. We have to really look at all these issues and look how they intertwine and how they intersect and how they are really continuing to hurt our region as a whole. Until we address them all, we won't get nowhere, and I know it's gonna take time. I know this is gonna be a generational thing, but we can't go to sleep, we can't give up. We all have a role in this somehow. I'm not saying be a protester, I'm not saying be on a commission, but you have a role in making change. So like you said, you don't have to have your children continue to live the same lifestyle that you lived.
Do we have the leadership in place to do the things you're talking about?
Definitely, definitely. The young people give me hope. And I think it's a lot of community members as well that see that we really need this change. Community, labor, faith. A lot of people in this region, I think, is ready to take on this charge, even though it's going to be difficult. We don't know the pathway. We gave a path, but I think people are ready. They're ready for change.
We just have a few seconds left, but I'm curious, how will you measure, how will you know when what you all did was a success?
Roisin will probably still be around. I don't know if I will or not, but it's going to take time. We've already seen success. We'll see how Senate Bill 5 works out. Accreditation for police departments is going to be huge. We'll see how that works out.
All right, we'll leave it there, even though I know we'll be talking about this some more. Thank you all for your time. Roisin, Kevin, Jason, we appreciate it, and thank you as well. Until next time, stay tuned.